All right, how many of y'all were here last week when we had mega church retreat bringing the message? I'm going to give you a synopsis of what he covered because the theme that he went through or the way that he presented that passage influenced how I'm going to present the passage that we're in today. So retreat's challenge for us last week was to put Jesus on trial and to test Jesus, to challenge him, challenge his words, challenge the Bible. Regardless of whether you're a Christian, Muslim, Hindu, atheist, agnostic, whatever, put Jesus on trial. Test his words, test his life, what he said he did, and give yourself the opportunity to see why that matters. What we saw in John 18 continues into John 19. The religious leaders had already tried Jesus and condemned him. They had condemned him in their own hearts. And ironically, when they came to Pilate, they wouldn't enter his government building. They were concerned about being defiled right before Passover, despite what they were doing. And they were morally corrupt to their core, but still focused on ritual purity, as if that would absolve them or cover them or save them for what they were showing they truly were. And these were the same Jews who had revolted and fought against Rome, who were known for being unruly. And in a province that was full of turbulence, the Jews hated the Romans. They prayed for God to kill their oppressors, and they were longing for their freedom from the subjugation that they were under. For the Roman governor, this was a tough assignment. This was a province where you had to fight to control it, to maintain this uneasy peace, yet still ensure that your duties to Rome were paid, that your taxes were collected. And a revolt would cause disgrace at the very least for a governor. And it wasn't uncommon for governors who failed spectacularly to be recalled or even executed. And so this instability was always present. It was always at the forefront of everything the Jews and the Romans did. Every interaction was colored by this. But there was something that the Jews hated even more than the Romans, and that was Jesus. They were so angry, they were willing to go to their most hated enemies if it meant that they could have their vengeance on Jesus. And the religious leaders hated him so much that execution by their law wasn't good enough. Stoning wasn't sufficient for Jesus. The Jews wanted the most brutal, the most barbaric, the most excruciating, the most horrific, the most shocking, and the most gruesome death that you could ever come up with, and that was crucifixion. And as the mob followed Jesus to the temple and then to the Romans, it reminded me of a scene where a pack of hyenas are surrounding a lion. And none of them are willing to take that lion head on. None of them will attack the lion from the front. They won't even do it from the back or the sides if they're alone. If there's a pack of them like that, some of them will come up and try to go after the lion from the back. But when they're separated or when they're trying to take that lion on by themselves, they know they're powerless. But this rabid crowd that was surrounding Jesus that wanted to tear him to pieces, they had completely failed, and all the time leading up to this. And what those hyenas failed to see is that Jesus was not before them as a lion. He was actually before them as a lamb, so spotless and blameless. But that angered the Jews. Jesus was there as a sacrifice. God had allowed all of this to happen because it was in accordance with his plan. The Jews and the religious leaders thought they were in control. They thought they were causing Jesus to go to his execution. But they were just as powerless as those hyenas before a lion. So this is where we start today. The mob is choosing to work with their most hated enemies because they hate Jesus more. The people bring Jesus to the Roman governor, Pilate, and throughout this passage, we'll see who was really on trial that day. And I say that because I want you to see how through these verses, Pilate transitions from being a confident representative of Rome into more of a cowed bystander who allowed an innocent man to be butchered because Pilate was unwilling to pay the price for upholding truth. So I want you to read with me. We're going to start in the beginning of John 19. So this is John 19, verses 1 through 3. Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. They came up to him saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and struck him with their hands. But why did this happen? Why are we in this position? When Pilate had just said in the end of chapter 18 and verse 38 that he found no fault in Jesus at all, he repeatedly says this throughout these verses. I find no fault in him. But we see the early signs of cracks or compromise in Pilate's character. He gave in because the crowd insisted. He allowed his soldiers to beat and to mock and to humiliate Jesus with the purple robes and the crown of thorns. Not because it was just or was necessary or that was proper, but because Pilate was trying to appease the crowd, appease the mob. So who's really on trial here? Whose virtue or character is being tested? Purple robes were made from rare dyes. They were reserved for kings. The crown is obviously for royalty, but the thorns were there just to torture him. The flogging and the whipping and the scourging was so brutal, it was not permitted against Roman citizens without a trial. And if you remember in Acts 22, a Roman commander had gotten a hold of Paul, and he had ordered Paul to come into the barracks to be bound and stretched out to be whipped. But before they could strike him, Paul asked the centurion if it was legal to whip a Roman citizen without trial. And as soon as he said that, the commander and his men were greatly alarmed because they hadn't done it yet, but they were preparing to. And just the fact that they were preparing to whip a Roman citizen without a trial was significant. There would be severe consequences if Paul complained about this. But again, why is this so significant? Why this detail? When Chris last spoke, he showed us the image of a whip that was used called the flagrum. That whip was designed for one purpose. It was to tear chunks of flesh out of your body. And as you were whipped from your shoulders down to your legs. And that process of being whipped was so brutal, so extreme, that men sometimes died from the shock and the blood loss alone of this beating. So this experience that Jesus just went through, the suffering to the point of what had caused others to die, now presented to the Jews again with Pilate announcing his innocence. So he had just beaten this man nearly to death, not because there was any reason, not because there was any cause for it. There was no need to bring a confession. Pilate was doing this just to appease the Jews. And again, Pilate is still hoping to be done with this. From the Roman perspective, there's no crime, there's no fault. This man has been thoroughly disgraced and humiliated. He should just be freed. If Pilate were truly in control here, this scenario should have ended a long time ago. But Pilate is showing that he's not in charge of this trial. He's not truly in charge of anybody. He himself is the one who's on trial. So in the next verses here, Pilate went out again and said to them, "See, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no guilt in him." So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." When the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, "Crucify him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourself and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die, because he had made himself the Son of God." Now, Pilate, again, he's bringing Jesus in front of the people, presenting him to them so they can see what he's done. He wants them to see how badly Jesus has been beaten, humiliated, and forced to suffer. He's still resisting their demands because he has some duty to the law, and he's trying to appease the mob, but they're far from satisfied. They demand that Pilate crucify him despite his protests, and that he can't find anything blameworthy with Jesus, not even the smallest issue. And he says again, "I find no fault in him." But those hyenas continue to circle, and they're looking for the opportunity to pull down their prey. And Pilate tries to partially absolve himself or remove himself from the process by saying, "I see no guilt. I don't want to be involved with this, so you go crucify him." Pilate is doing this intentionally because he knows it's impossible for the Jews to go and crucify someone. That was a power or a authority reserved for the Roman government, and he probably also knew that that method of execution was not something the Jews had in their statutes. Because by the law of Moses, the method of execution for blasphemy isn't execution, it's stoning. But the Jews weren't seeking their standard of justice for Jesus. They wanted vengeance. So their reason for all of this is finally given truthfully there in verse 7, where they're telling Pilate, he broke our law. He's claiming to be God. And when Jesus is claiming to be God and has irritated them and angered them to the point where they're at, they want him crucified because stoning isn't good enough. But the way Pilate responds to this is interesting. In verse 8, when Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. He entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate again said to him, "You will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" But Jesus answered him, "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given to you from above." Who's on trial here? Is it Jesus or Pilate? Who's usually scared when they're on trial? Not the judge. It's never the judge. Here, Pilate is showing that he's shaken. He's lost his confidence. He's lost that feeling of authority. And the Bible doesn't tell us exactly why Pilate became afraid. Was it the way that Jesus was talking to him? The way that he was responding to the words that he said? Was it what the Jews said? It's not unreasonable to think that for the Romans or pagans, he had grown up hearing the mythology, the stories of where gods came to the earth or where deities were walking around like normal men. So at this point, Pilate he's scrambling. He's looking for reason, for truth. He asked Jesus again, "Where are you from?" Despite having just had this exchange with Jesus in John 18:33. He's saying it again. He's desperate for something. And Jesus does the last thing that you would expect for someone in this situation as Pilate's questioning him. He starts off by saying nothing. But what would you do if you were in this situation? If you were in front of a judge and you were asked a question or you were given a chance to explain why you were there, you would talk incessantly. You would all of a sudden come up with all sorts of things to say, whether it was good or not. And if you were facing death, if you knew this trial would end in your death unless you could justify yourself, there is no chance that I would keep silent in that situation. If you were in that position, I'm sure you would become very talkative. But that's not what happened. Again, is Jesus on trial or Pilate? The man who supposedly had authority over life and death is facing Jesus, the man who truly has authority over life and death. Only one person in this exchange is exuding confidence and authority and peace. Pilate, through all this, is becoming incensed. He's panicking. He's anxious. But he's in the face of silence. So he reminds Jesus who he is. He says, "I am the governor of this province. I have the power and authority of Rome behind me. And you dare to not answer my questions." Jesus finally answers, but he shakes Pilate to his core by reminding him what power Pilate truly has in himself. And that's nothing. Earthly authority or power is subject to and derived from God. It is only given to man. And Jesus says to Pilate, "You have no authority except what is given to you. You yourself are powerless. You are nothing without Rome behind you." Again, Pilate's just devastated by the silence and the quiet words of Jesus. And so he returns to the crowd. In verse 12, from then on, Pilate sought to release him. But the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, in Aramaic, Gabbatha. So again, who's on trial here? Whose character is being revealed? The judge is now cornered. Despite his repeated attempts to release Jesus, to set him free, Pilate can't do it. The religious leaders had increased the pressure here. They had pinned Pilate in a vulnerable position. With their greatest weapon, they were exploiting politics. They threatened Pilate's position as governor with unwanted attention from Rome. The worst mistake a governor of a province could make is to allow unrest, upheaval, or revolt to be shown weak when challenged. Pilate was a nobody. He was only in this position because he married Caesar's granddaughter, and he was given this position as a throwaway, as an afterthought. It wasn't because of his title or his position or his heritage. This was really just a leftover. It wasn't a wanted or desirable position. He wasn't a friend of Caesar to begin with. And the Jews are calling this out. And they're also causing him to realize that he would never be a friend of Caesar. He would never be on Caesar's good side. If rumors spread to Rome of how he was letting an agitator to live, that he was allowing this man to challenge his authority, that he was being shown for his weakness in public. So now Pilate is on the edge of a decision, the same as Caiaphas was in John 16, that it is better for one man to die so others can benefit. That's what's going through Pilate's mind here. He's willing to sacrifice this man, not because he should be executed, but because it's politically expedient. It's best for him. Now, Gabbatha means high place. And as Pilate is walking up the steps to this place, he has time to make that decision. All this is going through his mind. He still had the opportunity to publicly show his true character, and that he would uphold what was right, that he would take the harder path. Remember, Pilate said this repeatedly, I find no fault in him. But he could not continue to resist the crowd. In verse 14, now it was the day of preparation of the Passover, and it was about the 6th hour. He said to the Jews, behold your king. They cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. So Pilate delivered him over to them to be crucified. So for the last time, Pilate presents Jesus again. This trial is nearing its end. And the mob responds again, clearer than ever. They're demanding blood. That's all they want. Pilate again challenges them, questioning, why would you do this? This makes no sense. The Jews then fully expose their corruption and their rebellion before God. They loudly declare they have no king but Caesar. This would be unthinkable for any Jew to say just hours before, days before. But they are so built up by their hatred for Jesus, they're willing to openly declare their allegiance to the Roman emperor, the leader of the people that they hate, the leader that's controlling them, that's oppressing them, that has them enslaved. They're willing to pledge their allegiance to Caesar if that means it gets what they want. Their hatred for Jesus is that strong, so fierce. But then Pilate fully exposes his weakness and his lack of control. He shows that he doesn't actually have authority and the ability to rule and to do justice because he permits the Jews to take an innocent man to the cross. And Pilate fails in his duty to justice. The trial concludes, but who is shown guilty in this trial? Who's shown guilty that day? Who was actually on trial through all this? Who else was exposed for their lawlessness, their sinfulness, and corruption? It wasn't Jesus. Pilate was on trial this whole time, and he never knew it. The Jews were on trial this whole time, and they never knew it. Through silence, through quiet words, and humility, the defendant in this trial, Jesus, unmasked Pilate and the Jews for who they really were. It showed their true selves. And it shows that lies can't stand in the presence of truth. Pilate's failure wasn't because he lacked evidence. His failure wasn't because he lacked opportunity. Pilate's failure wasn't because he lacked authority. Pilate's failure was because he knew the truth and he surrendered to pressure. Because upholding the truth was too costly for his personal ambition. So, just like Pilate, you're on trial with your life. You have the evidence, you have the opportunity, you have the authority to choose what you do. And the only question is if you will decide to let Jesus be the king of your life. So that's what we're going to take into our discussions today. Daryl, would you pray for us again?